Hi guys, welcome back to the garage. This is the second video on our French classic bikes. This one's about small capacity 2-strokes. The 4-strokes were covered in a previous video, so have a look for that in the playlist. All the bikes were photographed at a small village show for local enthusiasts in central France. Up is an Alcian 125, which dates to 1954. Alcian as a company was formed in 1904 at Neuilly-sur-Seine. Apologies for my pronunciation and all the other pronunciations throughout the video. And they made motorbikes up until 1954 when they were bought out by Peugeot. Peugeot kept producing them under the Alcian name for a further 3 years. And then, sadly, it was quietly dropped and everything just stayed as Peugeot from then on. The motor in this one is a 2-stroke Zerker motor with a 3-speed gearbox, which gave it 45 mile an hour top speed, which is not too bad, I suppose, for the time. The most interesting thing about this engine, though, for me, is that if you look at the front engine mount, it has a clamp which wraps round the frame down tube, which is rather unusual. Next up we've got an Automoto, a company which had been in existence from the end of the 19th century. Peugeot had taken over the motorbike part of it in the 1930s, or at least merged with it, if not actual total control. And again, a bit like Alcian, by the early 60s, they just quietly dropped the name and continued with Peugeot. This one's a 100 VML, and it seems to have got all the factory bits and bobs on it, all the different little bolt-on fairings and stuff. It's clearly got very strong bicycle origins. If you look at the frame, it looks more bike than push bike, I should say, than motorcycle. And is clearly aimed at the commuter market. So it's got weather protection and floorboards and all that sort of stuff. The engine, though, may be familiar to UK enthusiasts because it's actually a Villiers unit, a 98cc 2-speeder, which was made in France under license and used by quite a few small French manufacturers. It managed to haul the Automoto up to about 40 mile an hour and gave about 120 mpg, which, quite frankly, would have been perfectly acceptable figures 40 years later. So a good advanced little runaround. Sticking to the concept of commuter bikes, this next one is a Motorcon Moby. Now, like other manufacturers around Europe, including the British, the sales success of Vespa and Lambretta made them desperate to see some of the same action for 2 reasons. One, there was clearly a lot of money to be made, and 2, it was biting deeply into the small motorcycle market, and therefore they were desperate to try and bring out something of their own. And this little Moby combines elements, I think, from both the main Italian rivals. The tubular frame and the shape of the tubular frame, the way it runs, the style of the leg shields and the running boards are very much Lambretta to my eyes. The Moby was only manufactured for 3 years because it had a few mechanical issues to begin with, which is never a good start for any motor vehicle. And it was also considerably more expensive than the Italian competition, which didn't bode well. The engine in it's a 2-stroke 125, which is typical scooter sort of fare for the time. But the drive to the rear wheel was by a chain enclosed in an alloy case, unlike the Italian stuff. The leading axle front forks rely on rubber, what's the best way to describe it, not bungs as such. They're like exhaust hanger type mouldings. And that system was actually very popular with French trailer manufacturers around that time because it's very cheap, quite robust, and simple to replace if anything went wrong. The wheels are split rim, like Vespa and Lambretta, and in this case are secured to the hub by 4 lug nuts, which again looks very Vespa for this period. The spare wheel is carried on a frame around the rear light, which again is a method that Motor Vespa, the Spanish wing, was to use for some time in the 1960s. So they tried the best. They tried to pull the best bits of all the Italian manufacturers into this design, but sadly it wasn't to be. The next bike is a Montego, a company which started during the First World War and managed to continue up until the mid-50s. This bike was pretty much its last effort, its last gasp. The advertising at the time aimed it very squarely at female riders because they had been seduced by the Italian manufacturers, Vespa again, and female riders and drivers, because the same was happening with cars, was a large untapped market that they wanted to get into their product range. The bike itself is a halfway house, really, between a scooter and a moped. Again, it's powered by 2-speed Villiers, but the controls are odd. There is a fuel on and off knob and a choke knob mounted on a dash, sort of halfway down the leg shields, and the starting was by a pull lever on the right hand side, so there's no undignified kicking involved. You just yanked the handle and off you went. But again, it was no competition to Vespa, who were actually producing scooters in France at this time under license, despite the Montego offering better handling because it's got bigger wheels and things. The Vespa just had more charm. Yet more commuter fun now with this Peugeot. It's part of the post-war 55 range, which had many, many variants, with and without suspension, front and rear. You had girders, you had telescopics, you had rigids, you had rear shock absorbers. This one's a 1954, so virtually at the end of the line. And you can tell this because it had additional panels on the side covering up the carburetor intake. The engine's a 125 3-speed, again 2-stroke. During the time of production, you could get it with foot controls or hand controls, and it was a sound enough little thing. It was generally held in the same regard as Peugeot's cars, namely solid, reliable, but perhaps a little bland. Another one of these actually pulled up, as you can see in this picture, as I was wandering round, pulling a little trailer on which was a wine barrel. A push SV125 split single 2-stroke next, with its pressed steel rear frame half and the front down tube. I think this one's early 50s. The carburetor's fully side mounted on this one, although there were also SVs where the carb was mounted further back at sort of like a 45-degree angle to the barrel. And there's also a sports version available that used a pair of carburetors to give you a bit more performance. On to mopeds next, and this first one is a Favor, which is a French company again. But by the 1960s, it had pretty much given up any attempt at manufacture and just sold rebadged Benellis, which is what this one is. It's a 3-speed, has a top speed around 40 miles an hour, and not much more to say on that one, really. Next up, an Italian Testi. Fabulous tank, loved the tank, and the styling overall is very, very nice. But I'm struggling to positively identify this one because it looks like the general shape of a Testi Grand Prix. But this is fitted with a Sachs fan-assisted engine, and as far as I know, the Grand Prix used Italian engines. And the other odd thing is the side panels have got more than a hint of Flandria about them to me. So perhaps this was who also used Sachs engines, I'd like to say. Now, so perhaps this is a rebadge for the French market. I don't really know. So if anyone recognises it and can positively identify it, please leave a comment below so we'll know what we're looking at. Equally stylish was this 1974 Motorcon 4D55. Lovely looking little bike. Has all the looks, but sadly none of the go to go with it. Because although the engine looks like one of the powerful Italian sports moped engines, it's not. It's restricted to meet the French laws at the time, which permitted 14-year-olds to ride about without a license as long as they had pedals, and it's restricted to 30 miles an hour. So lovely but slow. This one's got a drum up front, but they were also made with discs. In fact, I think most of them had discs, which probably would have been a bit of overkill, but again, I suppose if you're 14, the excitement of looking at a moped that looks this good with a disc brake on the front probably makes up for the disappointing lack of MPH, or kph in this case. So we'll finish off our look at the two strokes at the show with one of my favourites. I don't know why, there's no real reason for it, but I do love these. I also love the triples. There's a separate video on the channel about the Motorcon 4 350 triple, so have a look at that if you're interested. Anyway, these are the LT range from the early 70s. They were 125 two-stroke twins that were concocted from a variety of moped parts. And then, as was the way with lots of European manufacturers in the 70s, various bits were bolted on from different manufacturers to create a complete motorbike. So, for example, in the beginning they had Ceriani forks, which were then swapped to Telescos, and then within a year or two they went back to Ceriani's again. On paper, these were pretty well specified little bikes. They had oil injection, they had electronic ignition, they even had reversible handlebars on some models, so you could turn them upside down to give you a dropped stance, or pivot them the other way up for normal upright riding. The only thing they didn't have really was an overall coherence like the Japanese competition, and arguably they were slightly less reliable, which probably cost them sales. And of course, Japanese bikes, foreign bikes, always seem slightly more exotic than home brewed stuff. They're very interesting bikes though. I like them a lot. I don't think I've ever seen one here in the UK. I think I'd probably buy one if I saw one. And I don't think they're held in any sort of regard outside their homeland, sadly. The final bike is another LT, but this time in some rather fancier clothes. In a bid to drum up sales for these little twins, Motorcon started a race series for the bikes. The French call it a Coupe, a cup in other words, a racing cup, which was aimed at providing budget, low-cost racing for young riders so they'd get into competition. Several manufacturers have done that over the years. I remember KH400 had a coupe in France way back in the 70s. And as a result of that, a coupe model hit the showrooms to try and get some interest generated amongst young buyers. Now, the total number sold is open to debate. There seems to be various figures floating around, but probably around 1,000 found owners, which is not a huge amount really in the great scheme of things. It is a very cute little bike though. Well, I hope you enjoyed those. Please call back to the garage where you will find a variety of petrolhead rubbish on offer. So thank you for watching. Please subscribe and please have a look at my other videos. Bye for now.